now, a special event of the service is we're going to invite our speaker up, Mr. Bruce Shelton. And I couldn't think of anybody to introduce him that could do it with more love and appreciation and gratitude for him than myself. So Bruce has been a special friend through the years. He's, in a way, kept me going at times. And there's just not really a lot of words to fill in the details of his professional history. It doesn't matter. It's what he is now, and it all contributes to what he is now, which is, if we had bishops, he'd be the bishop of the fellowship. He's been, you've seen him, all of his projects that he does behind the scenes. He's such a grounded, practical, yet deeply spiritual man. And it's been my honor and my blessing to have a relationship with him as friend and seeker. So Bruce, do we have to pry you out of that chair, or do you spring up by yourself? God bless you, man.
Thank you.
He's the father of our church.
Yeah. Thank you. You know, Bishop Spruce, that sounds pretty good. It kind of grows on me, kind of grows on me. Okay. I thought, every time I talk here, I always start with, I ask everyone to join in just for a few moments of silence, because I want the talk not to come from my ego, but to come from the Spirit. We're just using me as an opening, to basically tell you what you really need to hear today to feed you spiritually. And so if we could all just be silent for a few moments. Let's recognize the presence of God, presence of the Christ, presence of divine love. Let's feel God's love right now in our hearts. Thank you, Lord. I have something to add up here. Let me get this. Today I wanted to introduce everybody to one of my best friends. This fellow's name is Neem Karoli Baba. And he's affectionately referred to by many of his disciples and friends as Maharishi. That's a title used in India for anyone that we might have in very high esteem. Particularly it's used with spiritual teachers, so a lot of folks refer to him as Maharishi. Maharashi. And this man has had a huge effect upon my life going back to about 1975, when I picked up accidentally, one of those books at the area bookstore called The Only Dance There Is by Ram Dass. That was my introduction to Ram Dass, and also my introduction to Neem Karoli Baba. He's helped me in all sorts of ways throughout the years. The impetus for this talk today was I was back bike riding with Jerry a few months ago, and I was somehow we started talking about this, and I was telling about this Hindu saint that has had such a wonderful effect on my life. And Jerry says, you're always talking about Emmett Fox and Eckhart Tolle. Let's hear about this guy. So thank you, Jerry. You're the cause of this, the reason for this talk today. Last winter, I asked my dear friend James Jacks to paint a portrait of Neem Karoli Baba based on a photo that we had, a very popular photo. And this is what he came up with, and I think it really captures him, his spirit. James took this to, he had not this picture, but a picture of this picture on his iPhone. He was having lunch at a Nawab Indian restaurant, and the owner of that restaurant, a lady named Neera, she looked at this, and she's Hindu. She looked at that and says, that's not a portrait, that's a living being. Now, in India, and this is also in Christian traditions, and any of the spiritual traditions, the teaching is that if we focus upon a photograph of a saint or spiritual being, we bring that person into our consciousness, which makes sense, because the thoughts are bringing that person, connecting us, and attracting that person to us. So I now have this in my meditation room, and every day I'm able to say good morning to Maharishi. He's been like a dad to me. This is Father's Day, and he's been a dad to me and so many other people as well. Now, in trying to figure out how I could tell, but first of all, before I go any further, I'd like to know how many people in this room have ever heard of Maharishi? Oh boy, this is pretty good. I'm impressed. How about Ram Dass? Let's see about throw hands. Okay, I'm speaking to the choir. Well, good. This is great. I was not expecting that. I figured a lot for Ram Dass, but I figured 2 or 3 would have heard of Neem Karoli Baba. Well, good. So we all, maybe some of you have been helped by him as well. I hope so. I'm sure you have. I thought, in terms of trying to tell you about him, I thought, where do I start? So it came to me the best way to introduce you to Maharishi would be through the eyes and experiences of Ram Dass, how he discovered this gentleman. And so that's the story I'm going to share with you. And in doing this, you'll also learn a little bit about Ram Dass, who's now, if you all know these guys, a lot of you do know these. You've probably heard some of the story about Ram Dass's discovery of this man. But hopefully I can say some things that perhaps you haven't heard before. It's very inspirational. And what's important about this search that he had for spiritual truth that Ram Dass had was that we're all on this journey. You see, we're all looking for spiritual truth. We're all trying to figure out, who am I? What's it all about? What's the purpose of my life? If we don't get answers to those questions. I have a young man I'm working with in my employment. I work as an addictions counselor, and he's 26 years old, and he's asking these questions, and he just can't get answers, And I hear that, and I think this is great. He's asking the questions. That's how we get answers. Until we start asking the questions, nothing happens. So, this is a story of Ram Dass. He's 30 years of age. He's at the top of his professional career. He has got his PhD from Stanford in psychology. He's working at Harvard University, which of course is the cream of the crop with colleges. And he's well liked. He says, my parents look at me and I can look in their eyes and tell that they're so proud of me, that I've made it. I have made it. And he says, he had his toys, he had his Cessna airplane and his Triumph motorcycle. He played the cello, had lots of friends, financially he was doing great, but there was just one problem. The big problem was, he says, he was unhappy. He says deep down, he looked at he had everything that the world would offer, but there's an emptiness. There's some deep unease deep within him that just kept gnawing at him. There's something missing. And it turned into a depression. He started actually getting depressed. So on the outside, he looked like he was the happiest guy in the world, but on the inside, there was this emptiness just gnawing away at him. And he said, there's got to be more to life than this. And then, as life happens to all of us, it's like our lives are a little bit like a kaleidoscope. We're looking at this design, and then the divine master shakes the wrist and a new scene appears, right? But what happened to him at this point was, a few doors down from him in the psychology department at Harvard, this new professor moved in. I know a bunch of you have heard about him. His name was Timothy Leary. And Tim Leary and him became the best of friends. He says, we became beer drinking buddies. And this guy, Tim, was interested in hallucinogenic mushrooms and hallucinogens in general. He was he was not just for recreational, but actually for research purposes. He thought, this is a way to go to different levels of consciousness that we can't find with our rational mind. So he says, he asked Ram Dass, by the way, his name at that time was Richard Albert. That's his birth name. His friends called him Dick Albert. So he asked Dick if he'd like to have try this drug LSD. He tries it, and Ram Dass says everything changed. He says, I've discovered dimensions of consciousness that I'd never discovered before. I found some peace, and I thought, wow, this is an amazing substance, you know. And this is back in the 60s. This is back around early 60s. And you may remember that was a time of exploration and new ideas, and we were all kind of pushing the boundaries. And they started all these research projects, and it went on for several years at Harvard. And to make a long story short, LSD fell in disfavor nationally, and it fell in disfavor at Harvard, and they didn't stop what they were doing, and they both got fired, which was unheard of. This had never happened at Harvard, where two professors who were tenured got fired. But it made national news back then. But Ram Dass says, we didn't care. We felt like we didn't care what society thought now. You know, we weren't trying to play. We just knew that this path we were on was working for us. And so for the next, he says, the next 5 to 6 years, we experimented with drugs, with hallucinogens specifically, and with LSD. He says, I took hundreds of trips. And he says, this is what happened. He says, after 5 or 6 years of this, he says, he started getting bored with it. Because he says, the problem was, LSD will take you up, but you always have to come back, you see. Come back where? Come back to your ego. Come back to where all the problems are, all the anxieties and neuroses and depression and anger. You always have to come back. And he says, I don't want to be high, I want to be free. So he started falling into despair once again. He thought he'd found a way, and it turned out this was not the way. He started feeling depressed again. And by the way, when we start feeling depressed about things like this can be a good thing, because it's that depression that motivates him to keep looking beyond what he's doing, you see. Whether it's depression or anger or anything that is disturbing to us, those feelings, as unpleasant as they are telling us something's wrong. So it motivates us to look beyond our ego to something greater. And so he had read this book called The Tibetan Book of the Dead, that was given to him and Tim Leary by Aldous Huxley. Now, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is read in India to people as they're dying, and it describes the different phases of death, both on this plane and on the next plane. And Ram Dass is reading this, and he's thinking, wow, these guys in India, you know, we're trying to figure out the consciousness. These guys in India have figured it out thousands of years ago. You know, I got to go to India. And so like a lot of Westerners at that time, there was a great interest, in Asian religions. We all know about the Beatles, maybe another Hindu saint out there. But there was a great interest, especially with the younger generation, the so-called baby boomers. We're all seeking spiritual truth, and so Ram Dass fell into that vein of energy. He goes to India, and he says for about 3 months, he and a friend of his friend had a Land Rover, and they drove around India and Nepal and Pakistan and Afghanistan. Remember, this was back in the 60s when things were a little bit quieter over there, and it was safe. But he says after about 3 months of this, he started, he says, we rode through a haze of hash. He says, I'm constantly, not LSD, but now he's using hash. He says, I have all these ups and downs, but it turned into just another trip. Just a bunch of highs and lows. More of my own reality leading me to despair. So he goes to India trying to find answers. He says, we saw a lot of, temples and drank a lot of bottled water and smoked a lot of hash, but I didn't find anything. But then, one day he's in Kathmandu in this hippie cafe. And some of us have been to Kathmandu. We know about that. Dale and Heidi and myself, we all visited there. Quite a city. And he's in Kathmandu, and this gentleman walks in, young guy, 23-year-old, blonde-headed surfer from Laguna Beach, California, comes in, and they strike up a conversation. And Ram Dass is talking to this young man, and he's realizing this guy has really got the answers I've been looking for. This young man had been there for about 3 or 4 years in India. He had integrated into the culture there, particularly the spiritual culture. He was a sadhu. He wore the robes, and he was given the name of Bhagavan Das by his guru, who is this gentleman here, Neem Karoli Baba. And he says, Ram Das is saying, this is what I've been looking for. So he asked if he can go with him and just travel a little, just follow in his footsteps and learn about yoga and so forth. And so they do this, and for several months. He says he's with this young man, and as he's going, he says, I attempted to tell him my usual charming stories about my life. Ram Das is quite a talker. Or I'd ask him questions about where he was going with his life, and this young man, Bhagavan Das, would just say to him, don't think about the past. Just be here now. Or he'd say, don't think about the future. Be here in the moment. Just be in the moment. And nobody ever talked to Ram Das like that before. So he says after several months of blisters, dysentery, and lots of hatha yoga, he was once again wondering if this is really what it was all about. And Bhagavan Das tells him one day, he says, I really need to go see my guru. He's in the mountains, up in the mountains. I need to get my visa restored. This gentleman, my guru, knows who to talk to get my visa restored. After all, I'm an American. I've got to I got to get my visa renewed. And Ram Das reluctantly says, okay, well, we'll go in the Land Rover up there. Now, the Land Rover, remind you, doesn't belong to him. And but he says, I really didn't want to go. He says, I had no interest at all in meeting a Hindu guru. He says, being the good psychologist that I was, I like Buddhism. Buddhism was just clean, surgical. You put your focus on your breath. It's just perfect. It quietens your mind. He says Hinduism was so messy. All these painted gods and loudspeakers in the temples and these wandering sadhus all looking more than just a little weird. I have no interest at all in Hinduism. So he goes reluctantly with Bhagavan Das, letting him use this vehicle, the vehicle that would belong to a friend of his. They're driving, and now the first night they stayed at a guest house, and that night Ram Das says he had to go to the latrine, so he goes out and he gets this strong feeling of his mother being present. He's looking at the stars, and he has a strong feeling of his mother, and she had died a year previously of spleen cancer. And he says he got this strong feeling of her presence. And he said, isn't that, he says the Freudian psychologist in him said, isn't that just what you'd expect from a guy thinking about his mother on the toilet? If you know about Freudian psychology, you'll appreciate that. So the next day, he drives up, they continue the journey, they get to the village. One of the villagers says to Bhagavan Das, the guru is up there on the other side of the hill. So Bhagavan Das, now the whole way up there, he's got tears. Bhagavan Das is just knowing he's going to meet his guru. He's overwhelmed with joy. And he's now running up this hill to meet his guru. And Ram Das really doesn't want to go because he's afraid about this car. He says, I'm looking suspiciously at all these villagers looking at it. And he says, I was paranoid. And I'm just wondering if one of them was going to steal the car when I went over the hill. But he says, I came this far, I might as well meet this guy, So they run up the hill, look on the other side, and there's this beautiful scene, this little old man sitting in a blanket with about 15 people around him, all dressed in white. And Bhagavan Das runs up to him and falls at his feet and just wants to touch his guru's feet. And Ram Das is looking at this and he says, man, this is just too weird for me. This looks like some kind of a cult, But he goes up to the guy and he says to this little old man sitting on the blanket, and he says, the little old man looks at him and he says, how much money do you have? And right then he's wondering, okay, this is just what I thought. And he says, how much money do you make in America? He says, well, one year I made $25,000. And he says, you came in a car, right? And he says, yeah. And he says, can I have it? Right? The guru's asking Ram Dass, can I have the car? And before Ram Dass can even reply, Bhagavan Das jumps up and says, if you want it, you got it. Right? Giving away the car. And Ram Dass says, wait a minute, this car doesn't even belong to me. Now what's happened is Ram Dass now is in fight or flight. Every cell in his body, his whole ego is just lit up. This is just what I expected. He says, my dad was a Jewish fundraiser in Boston, and I saw those guys work at credit, and they could raise thousands of dollars. But nobody's done it as fast as this guy. And it's clever, right? And so then, with all this, you got the scene now. So with all this said, the Guru then says to Ram Dass, last night you were under the stars, and you were thinking about your mother. And he says, yeah. Now right then he's thinking, how in the world does this guy know I was under the stars thinking about my mother? He says, I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell Bhagavan Das. I didn't tell anybody. How could he have figured this out? And in Ram Dass's mind, he's a very smart guy. He's going around in circles trying to figure out how this guy could have known this. Then the Guru says, last year now he's doing this in Hindi as a translator. He says, last year she died of spleen cancer. This is the Guru telling Ram Dass this. And when he says the word spleen, he says that in English. Well, right then, he says two things happened. He says, number one, my mind went around and around with every possible conspiracy theory imaginable to try to figure out what had happened. I thought, they must have a dossier on me. These guys are really good. But the more he thought it, nothing worked. And he says, at a certain point, my mind went poof, use his words. The second thing that happened, he said he felt this strong, violent, that's the word he uses, wrenching feeling in his heart. And he did not know what was happening at that time, but he learned later that what the Guru was doing was opening his fourth chakra and opening his heart. And at that point, he says, I had a feeling of love that poured up within me that he'd never experienced in his entire life. It was overpowering. It couldn't be put into words. And he says, I can't paraphrase as well as the way he explains it. He says, I cried and I cried and I cried and I cried. I wasn't sad and I wasn't happy. The closest I can say is I was crying because I was home. I had carried my big load up the hill, and now it was all done. The journey was over, and I had finished my search. So that was a life-changing experience in Ram Dass's life. He wanted now, he says, I finally found, feeling that. He says, I finally found what I've been searching. This man is it. And he spent the next 6 months living at the ashram there, and learning all about yoga, learning all about what it's all about, really. And he came back to this country after 6 months. As he was leaving, one of his disciples said that, the Guru said, Maharishi just wants to know you have your blessings for your book. And he says, to himself, he says, what book is that? I'm not planning on writing a book. So he comes back to this country, he gives a series of talks, and to make a long story short, this book comes out in 1971 called Be Here Now, which became extremely popular with the so-called baby boomer generation. Be Here Now gave answers, spiritual answers to people. Larry Brilliant, who was the gentleman who wrote the inspirational reading today, was involved with all this back then. He's a medical doctor. And he said that up to that point, he had been a political activist. And he says, this book changed my life and the lives of thousands and thousands of other folks our age who we were trying to change things out there, and we realized really it was all within ourselves. So he started that journey he started everybody on this journey of spiritual awakening. So Ram Dass, in his most recent book called Polishing the Mirror, which is my favorite book. He's 87 years of age, by the way, by now. He had a stroke when he was 67 years of age. So 20 years now, and but his best work has come since the stroke. He says 40 years, and this is really writes in Polishing the Mirror. He says 40 years and one near stroke later, catastrophic stroke later, it is still quite a journey. Being here now is even more relevant for me. Being in the moment, okay? This is the theme of today's talk, is this whole idea of being here now, being in the moment. Being in the moment, at ease with whatever comes one way, becomes contentment. This practice allows me to be present to love, and we've heard that word, that theme of love through Chris's song and Robert today. This is another big major theme today, is love. He says, this practice allows me to be present to love and to serve others and to express unconditional love in the world. When you are fully in the moment is all there is. It feels like time slows down. When your mind is quiet, you enter into the flow of love, and you just flow from one moment to the next, as naturally as breathing. And so Ram Dass says that when he was talking with his guru, he would ask him questions that he'd been longing to get answers for, and he wanted the guru to give him, he expected the guru to give him very esoteric answers that you'd have to go to a Himalayan monastery and look in the hidden library with. He says the answers he gave him were all so simple. The question was, how do I become enlightened? Anybody in this room ever asked yourself that question? How do I wake up spiritually? He says, love everybody, serve everybody, and remember God. Other times he said, feed people. So Ram Dass says these three teachings, these three tenets, love, serve, remember, which is up here, are the three tenets that have guided him all these years. And way back in the 70s when I heard this, they really had become my tenets as well. And Crosby, Stills and Nash wrote wrote a song one time, sang a song, Teach Your Children Well, and there's a line in there that says, we all need a code by which we can live by. This is a good code. Just three things: love others, love God, love yourself. Serving is simply love made manifest. It's the behavior. It's the expression of love. Remember what? Remember God. Remember who you are. Remember your divinity. Remember your Christ's presence within you. Ram Dass asked him, how do you know God? The answer was, the best way to worship God is to see God in all form. God is everything. So, see God where we think we have problems, like financial problems or relationship problems. See God as being there behind that problem, because God is omnipresent. If we can connect with God, the power of the problem will just fade. Okay, and our ability to deal with it will get the insights that we need. So the idea is see God in all form. God is everything. How do I meditate? Well, meditate, he says, this is a good one. He says, meditate like Christ. When Christ meditated, he became pure love. So he doesn't say you have to sit on a map and follow your breath for 10 hours every day and for 40 years in a monastery to meditate and to find God. He says, meditate like Christ. When Christ meditated, he became pure love. So anytime we're loving someone else, you see, we're meditating. I like that. I like that teaching. Coming to an end here, lessons from this talk. Number one, Maharishi to me shows me our human potential. He shows me what I'm capable of being, just as Jesus does, you see. Jesus says the things that I do, you can do likewise and even greater things. And so the whole idea of Jesus' teachings and Maharishi's teachings is basically to awaken our highest potential within ourselves. So these guys are a little bit further up the mountain, you see, than the rest of us. And we look at them and they're able to say, hey, this is what you do. Just follow this path. And we're here to help you along the way. Second thing that I think a lesson from this talk today for me is that, as I said at the beginning, Ram Dass's search for God is our search. We're all, if you look at the story I just shared, he would go down a path thinking this is it, and it's like running into a dead end. He thought this is not going to work. but what happened? The universe someone else came into his life. Was it accidental Tim Leary happened to move down the hall with him? Was it accidental that he happened to be in that surfer bar in Kathmandu, and this 23-year-old kid from California just walked in and led him to this guru? Was it accidental he met this guru? You see, of course it's not accidental. Your life is like this, and my life as well. It's a plan. I said last time, our lives are a lot like, when I spoke here, I said our lives are a lot like a Persian rug. You look underneath the Persian rug and you see all these strings and strands going everywhere. It looks like mass chaos, confusion. And that's the way our lives feel sometimes, doesn't it? Like, what's going on here, And then, but if we flip it over, it turns out that there's a beautiful design, you see. There's a divine plan that we're all following, okay? And so that's my talk today, and I hope that you have enjoyed getting to know this guy a little bit better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.